Good afternoon, students. I've been getting a lot of questions about Milestone 4 and exactly what I'm looking for there. So I thought maybe it would be wise to take a moment, record a quick video, just talk you through each of the requirements and kind of what I'm looking for and how that kind of maps back to the projects that you've been working on leading up to this milestone, because I'm not sure that it's necessarily clear. So first of all, I don't have a project clone to kind of show you, so I'm going to uh, take it and just create an empty folder for the project. I suppose I should ask one of you guys if you'd be okay if I cloned your project and use that for the but here we have our project folder, and I've given you this database. Now, if you click on this file, it's going to basically tell you it's way too large to download. It's also not very useful to open and look at because it's actually technically a binary file that it represents all the data in the database. So it's just going to look like gibberish. So how you can actually access it is by using that library, the database library, Better SQLite 3, that we've used before, and you really want this to be in your project. So in the project folder, I'm going to create a directory db to hold that, and I'm going to move that into that directory. So I'm going to say move community chest SQLite 3, and actually I'm going to move it, I'm going to copy it. I want to be able to delete this when I'm done and not commit these changes to what you guys are going to see, because I don't want to pollute your starting point. We're going to copy that database and we're going to put it in project db. Go ahead and call it community chest.sqlite3. So now if I open that project folder, notice there's a db folder, there's our community chest. And then in the workspace, I also need to do npm init just so I can set this up as a project. You obviously have already got this because you're cloning the project that you've been working on. And then we have to install Better SQLite 3. So we have access to that library. Okay, and this is the same steps that you were doing with your with the blog project when we started setting up SQLite 3. So now we've got that database in there and we want to actually mess around with it. One of the ways we can do that is we can do that from the command line by firing up the interactive node shell. And scoot this up just a hair because it looks like it's off the video. There we go. And in here, we'll go ahead and, first of all, require that database library. So const database equals require better SQLite 3. Oh, and you're going to see something here. Good, because I am in the workspace folder, which is not where we want to be. I actually want to be in the project. Now I can restart node, grab that Better SQLite 3, create our database variable, which we're going to construct a new database, which is, by the way, why we use capital D. Remember, in JavaScript, a capital letter on a function name indicates it's a constructor. And that's actually what gets exported from this Better SQLite 3 library is a constructor. And so we can go ahead and say we want to look at E slash community chest. SQLite 3. And now, if we want to take a look at the table I've already built for you, which I talk about at the start of right here, we already have a table named boxes that has these columns, ID, name, left, wrong. So we can actually select that by preparing a SQL statement, select star from boxes. And this should be familiar to you guys from your database course. If you're taking 560, this is the same kind of work that you were doing there. If you haven't, we're not going to require you to do a whole lot, so you can probably pick up everything you need as you go along. So db.prepare prepares the SQL statement, and then we're going to either invoke .all if we're trying to grab a lot of records, or .get if we want a single record. So we want all the boxes, so we're going to use .all. If we run that, notice that we get back an array, and this is a JavaScript array that contains all of those boxes that are defined. And notice this is a different set than we've been working with before. So we have the Sunset Zoo. We do have the Handy Corner Shopping Village, which is in there before, and Sisters Sound, the Student Union. I think McCall is new, Horticultural Services is new. So it's a slightly different list, just so that we can enforce that we are going to be serving them correctly. Okay, so for this requirement 3, we need to create an endpoint to serve that. So what we're going to take is we're going to take this query, this style of query, we're going to, at our endpoint, first hit our database, grab all of the locations we have. We're going to stringify that, JSON stringify, turn it into JSON string, and then we're going to turn around and we're going to serve that string. So instead of serving an HTML file or an HTML string, we're now serving a JSON string. And we're going to do this from an endpoint, so kind of like we did in our project for the log. We're going to have a folder for our endpoints. And in that endpoints folder, we're going to have an endpoint that is specific to box locations. So in here, we are going to get all boxes from the database, turn all boxes in, turn that array, because that will give, with better SQLite 3, it actually gives it to us as a JavaScript array, into a JSON string, and we're going to serve that JSON string. And to serve the string, we're just going to set up the header. We need to set the content type. And the content type for JSON is application JSON. And so you're going to set the header, you're going to set the content length, the content type, and the headers, and then you're going to serve this JSON string as the body. So the same place that we normally serve the variable HTML, which is an HTML string, we're going to serve this JSON string. And that's all there is to this endpoint. It's pretty straightforward. And this endpoint corresponds to route / box locations .json. Now you already have a box locations JSON file in your static directory, which is what your index file has been using, your index file in your site.js to generate that index page. This is replacing that file. So we're going to delete that file now, and this endpoint is going to serve, when you request that file, it's going to generate the file instead. It's going to give it based on what's in the database. Means if we update our database, we add new box locations, they're automatically going to get served. And if you've done this endpoint correctly, when you fire up your server, you should see your index page load just like it was doing before, but now it's going to have the different set of boxes. So if you want to make sure it's working, you should notice that it has Potter of Hall, these different locations we have in here. The Handy Corner Shopping Village, Sisters of Sound, K-State Student Union, the shopping center, McCall, Walmart, Potter of Hall, Paramore Coffee. Should be exactly this set. Okay, and one other trick that people didn't realize, your box is a full Linux box, which means we can actually leave this terminal open. If we want another terminal to actually serve our server, we can fire up another terminal. So you can leave one just connected to your database so that as you go in and make changes, that's easy to do. And speaking of making changes, that's what point 4 is all about. You need to create a new table in Community Chest SQLite 3. So this one that we've loaded up here, that's going to store a request for a specific box. And it needs to have a column for its own identifier. It needs to have a box ID which references box's ID, so it ties back to the other database as a foreign key. And then a text column which is the request, so the text of the request. And then an int column fulfilled. And this is really used as a Boolean, but in SQLite 3 it doesn't have a Boolean type. So if you want to do a Boolean, you use an integer, and you use 1 to represent true, 0 to represent false. And better SQLite 3 will actually interpret that as a, well, in JavaScript, 1 is considered truthy and 0 is considered false. So it will just work. You can trust me on that. So that is going to be used for the request. You have to add that. And this fifth point, you're going to create a dynamic page. So right now we still have our index page. It's still dynamically generating on the client side using site.js. Now we're creating another page that's going to be at this location, so box location /ID, where this is replaced with a number. So when we, for example, say /box locations 4, which is the key to the K-State Student Union, this page should be displaying the information only about the K-State Union box. And that information should include, obviously, that map, but now you can make it bigger because it's the only one on the page. So go ahead and take up the space you have available, make it larger, make it pretty. You're obviously still going to say, oh, this is at the K-State Student Union, but the big thing you're adding now is a list of requests that are specific to this box. So we can get that list, again, from that table we just generated by selecting all of the boxes that are in there. So kind of our endpoint, we're going to have a new endpoint in here, which is box location, and you can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it box location details because it's basically showing a specific box. And our to-do here, step 1, we need to get the box locations. So we'll select box location data. And there's a couple different ways we can do this because we also need the request for that box. So in SQL, we can do this as one request with select star from boxes inner, or sorry, not inner, but left join. And we're going to left join the whatever you called your request table. So if it's requests, we do requests on, and then we have to do join, which would be boxes dot ID equals requests dot box ID. Because remember, our foreign key is box ID, and that's linking to the box's ID. Then we need to do that where boxes dot ID equals, and then in this case we're going to use a question mark because we're going to prepare the statement, and that would go into a db.prepare. I'm going to use the template string because that can cover multiple lines. Just to help keep this legible in the video, I'm going to drop these so that we have these in different lines. They don't have to be on different lines. This is just trying to make it legible and readable for you guys. But I often will do that in code. And that's our prepare. Then we need to do a .get, and we're going to provide the identifier that gets plugged in this question mark. And that's how SQLite, better SQLite 3 also does protects us from a SQL injection attack, because SQL escapes these variables before it plugs them in. So that keeps us from having a vulnerability there. So what this will do is this will actually left join. So it'll give us an entry or a set of arrays. Sorry, not a get. We want to do all here. This will give us an array that contains all of the requests plus the box data to those requests. So it's going to be an array. The box data is all going to be the same. It's going to be the same name for all of them. It's going to be the same lat and long. So we really only need to look at one entry to get that information, but the requests are going to be repeated. This does it as a single query. If we were doing this with MS SQL or MySQL, one of the ones we could actually change that so that this second half actually just becomes an array. SQLite 3 doesn't support that kind of sub-array generation. So this is kind of the dirty but very usable way we can do it. Or the other way we can get around this is we can actually do two queries. So we can do select star from boxes, just like we did before, and just grab the one box. So we'd use .get, where ID equals question mark. And again, keep this readable, not running off the screen there. Let's do it like that. And then we have to do a second statement, because this one will just grab the individual boxes information. And notice that because we're using get, it's not an array, it's a single object. And that is the one box that we're asking about, box whose ID is that. If we're doing request, we're going to select star from request, or whatever you name that table. And the where clause, we can say boxes underscore ID, so our foreign key, and all in ID. This is going to give us an array that contains all of the requests, and then we can pull those request strings out, which is called request. So it would be request.request, basically. So this would get us all as one array, and then in your template, you kind of got to do some logic to say, well, I only want to display the map once, and I only want to display the name once, but then I want to display all the requests separately, so you do a for each around those. In this case, you kind of have two things you're supplying to your template, an array of the requests, and then the data of the box itself. So you got to get that, and then you're going to step 2, render a template with data, and that should be an HTML template. And then step 3 is you're going to serve the rendered string. So this is very much what we did with posts. And the comments on the post are very much like the requests here, where we had a second table that tied back to the main table, and we could grab that data and show that data. So this ties very much back to that project that we just did, where we were building the posts and the comments that went with those posts. And the other thing you'll notice in here is that we also have a form that's going to show up on this page that should submit post requests. So that form has to have a method of post, and it should post to box locations, the ID, and then requests, where ID is the primary key of the box in question. Alternatively, you could just have it post to, well, actually the reason I did this is because this is following kind of the RESTful routes way of doing things, because the requests belong to the box but aren't the box itself. So this is where a RESTful route, this is what it would be if we were using REST. So we're going to just go ahead and use this. So that's another endpoint. And that one, we could call something like create.js. And that is what 6 is all about. So we create an endpoint that saves the new request by processing that post request. So in here, our step 1 is to get the request data from the form. And you can either do that here, or like I said in the hints, that parse parse body or load body that we wrote a couple lessons back, that actually matches Express middleware. So since we're switching to Express, which I kind of skipped over, but create an Express app, set up its routing. So in our source folder, we're going to create an app, which is going to be our Express app. And so here we'd require Express. We create the Express app. So const Express equals require Express. And of course, you have to install this using npm install. So the same steps that you did when you went from the blog post one, blog exercise 1 to blog exercise 2. And then we can create our app. Express, and then we can register our routes. So app.get, and we're going to have a route for box locations.json, and that's going to invoke this box locations endpoint, which you're going to have to pull in and require. So const just like we've done before. This is and also on the requires, just to review, because I have had some people kind of bump on this. If we don't have the period / in front, when we're actually saying is this is something that's installed in the node modules directory or globally, and node will find it. It's a defined library. If we have a period or a double period in front, that means we're looking for a file. A single period just means in the directory that this is actually in. So the app is in the source directory, and we want to look at the endpoints, but actually should be a subdirectory of source. It doesn't want to move it for some reason. There we go. So in that case, because this is in the source directory, from that directory we need to drill down one directory, and then in that directory we're going to look for box location.js. If you do 2 periods in a POSIX file system, that says go up one directory. So here we'd have, if we did up one directory, we'd have to go back down to source and then to endpoint. If you do want to go up 2 directories, that's just another set of dots. So you can go up as many directories as you need. But we just really want it. Whatever's easiest to get you where we need to be is what we do. That's going to get our box locations. So you're going to do this for each endpoint. Now with middleware, so for the create requests one, we can say and box locations :ID and then requests, and notice it's a post request. Now if we wanted to pass through some middleware before it moves on, we actually give the middleware first, so load body, and then the endpoint. Endpoint would be create requests, and you have to load both of those as using the require. So those would need to be loaded. But what happens is when we hit this request, we're first going to execute any middleware, and if you have more than one middleware, you just keep adding them in the middle there. So it processes through the middleware, then it moves to the next piece of middleware, the next piece of middleware, the next piece of middleware, until you hit endpoint, which is what why we call it an endpoint. It's the last thing you look at. Now, each one of these has the ability to stop early. If you look at the load body that you worked on before, it has a function that looks like this: request, response, and next. And what it boils down to is it has a full access to the request and the response object, just like the endpoints do. And it's usually modifying those. So in this case, we parse the body and we attach it to this response object's .body. We add a brand new variable, a new property that wasn't part of the response to begin with, which is the body that we parsed out of that form. And this next is actually a callback function that gets invoked when this middleware is done successfully. Now, if there was an error processing whatever this middleware is responsible for, it can actually stop and serve an error code at that point and just never invoke next, so you never move down the chain. So you can drop out of that middleware pipeline if there's a problem. And we'll see this again because when we do authentication, you'll come back and you'll use middleware to make sure the user actually is authenticated and logged in before they can do the next step. That's for Milestone 5, so we won't have to worry about that just yet. But you can go ahead and use the load body you already wrote as a middleware piece, and it just drops in. It doesn't need any changes. You just need to require it and drop it in for that. Okay, so we kind of talked about express routing, the express static middleware. Actually, for that one, you can just call app.use and pass in express.static. And you need to tell it what directory is the static directory. So if that's static, then put in static, and it will go ahead and serve everything out of that directory. We could use app.use for load body. And if we do that, that means that before any of these endpoints are going to be run, it's going to be run. So that's the same as putting load body as middleware on everything, like that. Now, if you do this, then you don't have to do this. These can all load. The downside is now that gets called on every request, whereas if we just put it here, we're only invoking it when we're trying to hit this particular route. So when they just want to see the index page, when they just want to see the box locations, when they just want to see the details page, we're not even bothering. If there's a body, we're ignoring it. It's not being parsed, and we're not dealing with what's in it. So this is kind of a more efficient way of doing things. But you could do it the other way. I wouldn't count off for doing it though. Okay, so that brings us back down to create an endpoint to save new requests. So this create request, step one, we get the response data from the form, which you're actually doing through the middleware before we even come into this endpoint. So at this endpoint, that data should be in request dot body if you use the middleware. If you don't use the middleware, you've got to pull it out somehow. So you implement the same code we used in that middleware here in this endpoint. Step two is save the data to the database. And step three is kind of up to you, but it's what are you going to do? Where are you going to show the details page, or are you going to go back to the index page that now has a new box, or are you going to show some kind of completed page? My personal inclination would be to send them back to the detail page. And to do that, the easiest way to do it, take that response object and send a status code of 302, which means a redirect found. That just means please go to this URL instead, but don't memorize it because it's not always where you're going. So res.status code equals 302, and that makes it a 302 response. Now we have to tell it where to go, and we do that with a location header. So res set header location, and then the URL we want to navigate to, which if we're going to show the box locations, would be /box locations. And then you have to have the ID of the actual box that we just saved in the database. So you pull that out of when you save this. And if you go back to the post, I think we did something very similar with the post where we went ahead and served a redirect back to the post after somebody submitted a comment. So go look at that code if you need a little help there. And then once you have that header and that status code sent, you can just hit, boom, you're done. Of course, this has to be wrapped in a function as an endpoint. But that's the core of what I'm kind of looking for there. So basically, you're taking a lot of the ideas that we worked on with especially the blogs, where we're creating an Express app. We're setting up its routing. Notice that when we do this, we are reworking our server. So our server now loads the Express app instead of using the handle request. The handle request is really a primitive router. It's a hard-coded router that we explicitly said what every route we're looking for and how we're handling it. Now we can use a general purpose router, so we're just going to throw handle request away. You can delete that file. You're not going to use it anymore. We're now using a general purpose router that was built expressly for doing this, which is Express. We're serving those static files again here. Now we're doing something we learned how to do. We wrote our our serve directory and our serve files and all of that. We're throwing all of that away now that you know how to do it, and we're using the one that's built into Express. Um, and that's kind of the pattern that I'm using a lot in this course, where I teach you how something works by building something very similar to it, and then we switch to using a library version of that. I think that's a better way to learn libraries, to really understand what they're doing more or less under the hood, have a really good concept of what they're doing, rather than just learning, oh, I just need to put this line of code in and it magically works and I have no idea what it's doing. I want you to at least think through what that has to be doing to make it. And then obviously we're creating some endpoints. We're using template, or we're serving JSON. So this is actually an API at this point. This is an API endpoint. It is an endpoint that is meant to be consumed by a program, not shown in a browser. So this is actually hooking into that fetch request or that AJAX request, where you're grabbing the box data as a JSON string. And then we are also doing a little bit of templating, because we're creating a template in this 5 to serve the box location with the list of requests and the form for submitting new requests. And we're also making some changes to the database. We're adding a table, which we did also in the post. So we're really building our first kind of full stack app. We're shifting to doing a full stack app rather than with a web framework, rather than using more of a server page approach or something like that. And finally, we're creating the endpoint for taking and parsing that. So all these things we learned in the past few weeks now are coming together in our milestone. So that's really where we're going with that. I hope that that makes a little bit more sense to you. And if you have more questions, you can come back and ask me. But like I said, once you get this set up, basically when you go to your box URL, should get your index page. And then to go to the specific box locations, you want to either have a link in the card, so you're going to have to modify site.js a little bit to add a hyperlink. You can either make the whole card a hyperlink, so you click on the card and it takes you to the details page, or you can just add a link in the box, say show request or something like that, and click that link, and that takes you to the details page. But you should have that linkage there as well. So you do have to go back and modify site.js just a little bit to add that hyperlink. And that's what I would use, is actually a hyperlink. You don't need to invoke functions or anything. You're just going to add a hyperlink into that index page. Remember, the index page itself is dynamically generated on the client side using site.js. All right. I think that wraps up what I wanted to talk about. I hope this clarifies things a little bit and makes life a little easier as you start working on this assignment. If you still have questions, feel free to contact me. I'll be trying to keep an eye on Discord all weekend. Saturday afternoon, evening, I won't be available, but I'll try to keep an eye on it the rest of the week. And have a great time developing, guys. Talk to you later.